The phone call that destroyed my life came on a Tuesday afternoon, right in the middle of my shift at Seattle Children's Hospital. I remember the exact moment because I was holding little Emma Chen's hand, watching her breathe steadily after her appendectomy, when my phone vibrated in my scrubs pocket. The number flashed across the screen with an unfamiliar area code, and something in my gut told me to step out into the hallway to take it. If I had known what was coming, I might have let it go to voicemail. I might have bought myself a few more hours of blissful ignorance. But I answered, and everything I thought I knew about my family, about my father, about my own identity, shattered in the space of a 3-minute conversation. The voice on the other end was professional, detached, almost bored, a woman from Cascadia Bank's collections department. She asked if I was Zelda Vance, asked me to verify my social security number and date of birth. My heart started racing even before she delivered the blow. When she told me I was delinquent on a $600,000 mortgage for a property on Beacon Hill, I actually laughed. It was the kind of nervous, disbelieving laugh that comes when reality becomes so absurd that your brain can't process it any other way. There must be some mistake, I said, my voice echoing in the sterile hospital corridor. I don't own any property. I've never taken out a mortgage. I rent an apartment in Fremont. The woman's tone didn't change. She'd probably heard this exact response 1,000 times before. According to our records, Miss Vance, you signed the mortgage documents 18 months ago. The property is currently 3 months past due, and we're beginning foreclosure proceedings. I'm calling to discuss payment arrangements. My hands started shaking. This is impossible. I need to see these documents. I need to understand what's happening here. She agreed to send me copies of everything, her voice still maddeningly calm, still utterly indifferent to the fact that she'd just upended my entire world. After I hung up, I stood in that hallway for a long time, staring at the pale green walls, listening to the beep of monitors and the distant sound of a child crying. I felt disconnected from my body, like I was watching myself from somewhere far away. I knew, even then, what this had to be. Deep in my bones, I knew. But knowing something and accepting it are two entirely different things. My father, Victor Vance, had always been larger than life. A self-made businessman, or so he claimed, who'd built a modest construction supply company in Georgetown into something he could brag about at cocktail parties. He drove a Mercedes, wore expensive suits, and lived in a house with what he loved to call a million-dollar view of Elliott Bay. Growing up, I'd watched him charm everyone he met, watched him smooth-talk his way out of problems, watched him manipulate situations until they bent to his will. My older sister Tiffany had inherited his charisma and his ruthlessness. I'd inherited his stubbornness, but somewhere along the way, I'd also developed a conscience. I'd always been the disappointment, the one who chose nursing school over business school, who lived modestly instead of chasing status symbols, who questioned his decisions instead of following blindly. Tiffany was the golden child, running her interior design firm with the same aggressive ambition that made my father proud. I was the afterthought, the sensitive one, the one who was too emotional and didn't understand how the real world worked. But even knowing all of this, even understanding that my father had always seen me as less than, as somehow owing him for the privilege of being his daughter, I couldn't immediately accept that he would do something like this. Identity theft, mortgage fraud. Using his own daughter's name, her social security number, her clean credit history to secure hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was too cruel, too calculated, too much like something out of a crime drama to be real. Except it was real. The documents arrived 2 days later via certified mail. I sat at my tiny kitchen table in my studio apartment, the rain drumming against the windows in that relentless Seattle way, and I read through every page. The mortgage application bore my name, my social security number, my date of birth, my employer's information, but the income listed was double what I actually made. The signatures looked almost like mine, close enough that someone who didn't know better might not question them, but I could see the differences. The way the loop on the Z's was too wide, the way the final stroke of the A didn't quite curl the way mine did. Most damning of all was the property address. The house on Beacon Hill was my father's house, the one with the view he never shut up about. The house where we'd had Sunday dinners for years, where Tiffany would show up in designer clothes and talk about her latest high-end clients, where my mother Eleanor would flutter around serving food and pretending everything was perfect. The house that, apparently, I now officially owned on paper, along with the crushing debt that came with it. I called my best friend Sarah that night. She worked in mortgage lending at a different bank, and I trusted her completely. When I explained what had happened, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Zelda," she finally said, her voice tight with anger, "this is serious fraud, like federal crime serious. You need to report this immediately." "I know," I whispered, even though part of me had been hoping she'd tell me there was some innocent explanation, some way this could all be a misunderstanding. "I'm going to walk you through exactly what you need to do," Sarah continued, shifting into her professional mode. "First thing tomorrow, you're going to freeze your credit with all 3 bureaus. Then you're filing a report with the FTC. Then you're going to the Seattle Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. And Zelda, I need to tell you something else. My stomach dropped. What? Your father has asked me about mortgage processes before, multiple times over the past 2 years. He wanted to know about income verification, about how underwriters check documentation, about what kind of loopholes exist in the system. I thought he was just making conversation, just curious about my work. But now, knowing this, I think he was researching how to commit fraud. I felt like I was going to be sick. This wasn't some desperate, impulsive act. This was planned, methodical, calculated. My father had spent 2 years figuring out exactly how to use me, how to steal my identity, how to leverage my good name for his own purposes. There's more, isn't there? I asked, because Sarah's voice had that careful, Breaking Bad news quality to it. I looked up the property records after you called. There are multiple liens against that house. Contractors who haven't been paid. And Zelda, there's another mortgage application pending, for an additional $200,000 in refinancing. Using your name. The room started spinning. I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter, forcing myself to breathe. He's doing it again, right now. He's not even done using me, and he's already going back for more. Sarah came over that night with a bottle of wine and a folder full of information. She helped me freeze my credit, walked me through the FTC complaint process, and scheduled an appointment for me with the Financial Crimes Unit. She also told me, gently but firmly, that I needed to prepare myself for the possibility that other family members were involved, or at least aware of what was happening. Your sister's design company did the interior work on that house, right? Sarah asked. I nodded slowly, remembering Tiffany's social media posts about the stunning Beacon Hill renovation she'd completed, the before and after photos she'd used in her portfolio. The invoices for that work are listed in the mortgage documents as proof of the property's value, but I'm guessing those invoices are inflated, and I'm guessing your sister knows exactly why. I wanted to defend Tiffany, wanted to believe she wouldn't be part of this, but I couldn't. Deep down, I'd always known that my sister cared more about money and status than about ethics or loyalty. If my father had offered her a way to profit from his scheme, why would she refuse? The appointment at the Seattle Police Department was 2 days later. Detective James Corbin was a heavy-set man in his 50s with tired eyes that had clearly seen too much human ugliness. He listened to my story without interruption, taking notes, his expression never changing. When I finished, he opened a laptop and turned it toward me. Miss Vance, I'm going to show you something, and I need you to stay calm. The screen displayed a map of Seattle with various colored pins marking different locations. One red pin sat squarely on an address in Georgetown, right where my father's old warehouse was located. This is the IP address where the original mortgage application was submitted from. Detective Corbin said, your father's business address. We pulled the logs from the bank system. Every document upload, every form submission, all came from this location. I stared at the pin, feeling like I was watching my family disintegrate in real time. So, it's definitely him. It's definitely him, the detective confirmed, but it's worse than just the mortgage you know about. There are 2 additional mortgages in various stages of approval, both using your identity. There's a pending bankruptcy filing that was prepared but not yet submitted, also in your name. And there are multiple complaints from contractors claiming they did work on the Beacon Hill property but were never paid. He pulled up another screen, this one showing a scanned document. It was a personal bankruptcy petition, completely filled out with my information, with pre-written letters describing financial hardship that I'd never experienced. The handwriting on the signature line wasn't mine, but it was close. Close enough that if I were in crisis, if I were truly facing financial ruin, someone might believe I'd signed it in a shaky, desperate moment. He was building you an exit strategy, Detective Corbin said quietly. When everything collapsed, when the debt became unsustainable, he was going to have you declare bankruptcy. You'd take the hit to your credit, you'd face potential fraud charges, and he'd walk away clean. This wasn't just theft, Miss Vance. This was a setup. The rage that flooded through me in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever felt. It was hot and cold at the same time. It made my vision blur and my hands clench into fists. My father hadn't just stolen from me. He'd planned to destroy me, to sacrifice me completely to save himself. I was never a daughter to him. I was a tool, a scapegoat, a disposable asset to be used and discarded. What happens now? I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Now we build a case, Detective Corbin said. We gather all the evidence, document everything, and when we have enough, we make an arrest. I'm going to need your full cooperation. You'll need to provide handwriting samples, sit for interviews, potentially testify. Are you prepared to do that? Yes, I said immediately. Whatever it takes. He nodded approvingly. Good. Because I have to warn you, Miss Vance, this is going to get ugly. Your family is going to pressure you to drop this, to protect your father. They're going to make you feel guilty, like you're the one destroying the family. Can you handle that? I thought about all the years of subtle put-downs, all the times I'd been made to feel like my choices weren't good enough, All the Sunday dinners where I'd smiled and played along while my father held court and my sister basked in his approval. I thought about the bankruptcy papers with my forged signature, about the deliberate plan to ruin my life. I can handle it, I told him. The call from my mother came that evening. I'd been expecting it. A family like ours? News traveled fast, and I was sure my father had already spun some story about misunderstandings and overreactions. Zelda, honey, my mother's voice was high and trembling. What's this I hear about you going to the police? About some confusion with paperwork? Confusion. That's what they were calling it. Confusion. It's not confusion, Mom, I said, keeping my voice level. Dad committed identity theft and mortgage fraud. He used my name and social security number to take out hundreds of thousands of dollars in loans. He was planning to frame me for bankruptcy and leave me holding the bag for his debts. Sweetheart, you don't understand. The business has been struggling. Your father was trying to keep things afloat. He was going to pay it all back before you ever even knew. You're blowing this all out of proportion. He forged my signature, I said slowly, enunciating each word. He stole my identity. He filed fraudulent documents with multiple banks. And he created fake bankruptcy papers to destroy my credit when it all fell apart. That's not a business struggling, Mom. That's a criminal conspiracy. Don't you dare talk about your father that way. Her voice went sharp, defensive. He gave you everything. He paid for your education. He provided for you growing up. This is how you repay him? By running to the police like some kind of traitor? Something snapped inside me. Repay him? Mom, do you hear yourself? I don't owe him my identity. I don't owe him my credit. I don't owe him my future. He didn't give me those things as gifts. He gave them to me as investments that he expected to cash in whenever he wanted. You're going to destroy this family, she whispered. If you go through with this, if you testify against your own father, you'll tear us apart. Is that what you want? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of generations of dysfunction pressing down on me. Mom, he already destroyed us. I'm just refusing to pretend everything is fine while he sacrifices me to save himself. If you can't see that, if you'd rather protect him than acknowledge what he did to me, then maybe we need to be torn apart. She hung up without another word. 10 minutes later, I got a text from Tiffany. Short, cold, threatening in its simplicity. Family protects family. Don't do something you'll regret. I stared at that message for a long time. Family protects family. What a joke. Our family had never protected me. It had used me, dismissed me, taken me for granted, and now expected me to quietly accept being framed for crimes I didn't commit. I typed back, I'm not the one who should have regrets. Then I blocked her number. The next week was a blur of documentation and evidence gathering. Detective Corbin was thorough. We compared handwriting samples. We went through my credit report line by line, identifying fraudulent accounts and applications. We collected bank statements showing that I'd never received any money from these mortgages, never made any payments, never benefited in any way from the fraud. Sarah provided testimony about my father's suspicious questions. The bank's IT department confirmed the IP addresses and timestamps. The weight of evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't a case that would come down to my word against my father's. This was documented, time-stamped, digitally fingerprinted proof of systematic fraud. Through it all, my phone buzzed with messages from extended family members. Aunts and uncles telling me I was being ungrateful, that I was hurting my mother, that I should handle this privately instead of involving the authorities. Cousins who'd barely spoken to me in years suddenly had opinions about family loyalty and forgiveness. Even my father's business associates started calling, trying to smooth things over, suggesting settlement agreements and payment plans if I'd just dropped the police report. Every message made me angrier. Where were all these people when I needed support? When I was drowning in student loans while my sister got a trust fund for her business? When I worked double shifts at the hospital while my father bragged about his expensive vacations? When I was dismissed and diminished and treated like I should be grateful for the scraps of attention they threw my way? They hadn't cared about me then. They cared now only because my refusal to be a victim was inconvenient for them. I ignored every message. I focused on my work, on my patients, on building the case that would hold my father accountable. Sarah checked on me daily, bringing coffee and moral support. A few colleagues at the hospital, once they heard what was happening, offered their encouragement. It turned out I wasn't as alone as my family wanted me to believe. 3 weeks after that first phone call from Cascadia Bank, Detective Corbin called me into his office again. We're ready, he said simply. We have enough evidence to arrest your father and file charges. The prosecutor's office has reviewed everything and they're confident about moving forward. They're charging him with identity theft, mortgage fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit bankruptcy fraud. If convicted on all counts, he's looking at 5 to 10 years in federal prison. The reality of what was about to happen hit me like a physical blow. My father was going to be arrested. There would be a trial. I would have to testify. The entire ugly truth would become public record. When? I asked. Tomorrow morning. We're executing the arrest warrant at his residence at 6 a.m. I nodded slowly. Tomorrow morning. While my father was probably still in his expensive pajamas in his fraudulently obtained house, the police would show up and put him in handcuffs. Everything he'd built on lies would come crashing down. There's something else, Detective Corbin continued. We're also serving your sister's business with subpoenas for all documents related to the Beacon Hill property. The inflated invoices she provided constitute fraud as well. Depending on what we find, she may face charges too. Good, I thought viciously. Let her face the consequences of being complicit. Let her precious design firm's reputation be tarnished by her greed and dishonesty. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my apartment, listening to the sounds of the city, thinking about how everything was about to change. Part of me felt guilty, the part that had been conditioned since childhood to prioritize family harmony over personal well-being. But a larger, stronger part of me felt righteously angry. I hadn't done this to my father. He'd done it to himself. I was just refusing to be his fall guy. Around 3 a.m, I made a decision. Sunday dinners at my parents' house had been a family tradition for as long as I could remember. This coming Sunday would be the last one before my father's arrest became public knowledge. I was going to attend, and I was going to tell them all exactly what was coming. Sunday arrived with deceptively beautiful weather. The sky was that brilliant Pacific Northwest blue that makes you forget about all the rain. I drove to Beacon Hill, my car full of printed documents, evidence files, and the rage that had been building for weeks. The house looked exactly as it always had. Perfectly landscaped, freshly painted, every detail designed to project success and stability. My father's Mercedes sat in the driveway next to Tiffany's BMW. Through the windows, I could see my mother moving around the kitchen, preparing the elaborate meal she always made for these gatherings. I sat in my car for a moment, steeling myself. Then I grabbed my bag of documents and walked up to the door. My mother answered, her smile strained. Zelda, I wasn't sure you'd come. Wouldn't miss it, I said, brushing past her into the foyer. The dining room was set as beautifully as ever. My father sat at the head of the table, already working on his first glass of wine. Tiffany was showing him something on her phone, both of them laughing. They looked up when I entered, and the laughter died. Zelda, my father said, his voice carefully neutral. Good of you to join us. I didn't respond. I took my usual seat and waited while my mother brought out the first course. The tension in the room was suffocating. Tiffany kept shooting me hostile glances. My father pretended everything was normal, making small talk about his business, asking my mother about her garden club. I ate mechanically, waiting for the right moment. It came when my father raised his wine glass and said, "A toast to family. Whatever challenges we face them together." I set down my fork with a sharp click. Actually, I'd like to make a toast of my own. My father's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. Of course. I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick folder of documents I'd brought. I placed it on the table with a heavy thud, right on top of the beautiful tablecloth, next to the expensive china. To family, I said, my voice cold and clear, and to the truth that's about to destroy it. I opened the folder. The first document was the mortgage application with my forged signature. I pushed it toward my father. $600,000 in my name, a mortgage I never applied for, never signed, never benefited from. My mother gasped. Tiffany went pale. My father's face turned to stone. I pulled out the next document. Another mortgage, $200,000, pending approval, also in my name. And another, bankruptcy papers, pre-filled and ready to file, with a forged signature that's almost good enough to pass. And another, IP logs showing that all these documents were submitted from your warehouse, Dad. Time-stamped, location verified, irrefutable proof. I looked up at him, and I saw something I'd never seen before in my father's eyes. Fear. Zelda, he started, his voice low and dangerous. What do you think you're doing? I'm doing what you should have done, I said. I'm telling the truth. Tomorrow morning at 6 a.m., the Seattle Police Department is going to arrest you for identity theft, mortgage fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit bankruptcy fraud. They have all of this evidence and more. You're going to be charged with multiple felonies, and you're going to prison. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Tiffany stood up so fast her chair fell backward. You called the police? She hissed. Are you insane? Do you have any idea what you've done? I turned to her, my expression glacial. I know exactly what I've done. I've stopped letting our father use me as a scapegoat for his crimes. And by the way, Tiffany, they're subpoenaing your records too. Those inflated invoices you provided for the house renovations, that's fraud. You were in on it, and now you're going down with him. Tiffany's face went from pale to red. You bitch. You vindictive, selfish bitch. This is our father, our family. And you're destroying everything because of what, some misunderstanding about paperwork? I stood up, facing her fully. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is systematic, premeditated fraud. He stole my identity. He was planning to destroy my credit, my reputation, possibly send me to prison in his place. And you helped him do it. You created fake invoices to inflate the property value. You took money from his fraudulent scheme and used it to furnish your lifestyle. Don't you dare play innocent. My father finally found his voice. Zelda, sit down. We can work this out. There's no need for police involvement. This is a family matter. No, I said sharply. This stopped being a family matter the moment you committed a federal crime using my name. This stopped being a family matter when you decided I was expendable. My mother started crying loud theatrical sobs. Victor, tell her this isn't true. Tell her there's been some mistake. My father looked at her, then at me, and I saw the exact moment he decided to try to manipulate his way out. His expression shifted, became softer, almost pleading. Zelda, honey, I was desperate. The business was failing. I was going to lose everything. I thought I could fix it before you ever knew. I never meant to hurt you. You have to understand, I'm your father. I love you. The words that had once had the power to make me doubt myself, to make me feel guilty, to make me subordinate my needs to his, fell flat. I looked at this man who'd raised me, who'd provided for me in his own conditional way, and I felt nothing but cold contempt. You don't love me, I said quietly. You never did. I was a tool to you, just like everyone else in your life, something to be used when convenient and discarded when necessary. But I'm not going to be your victim, Dad. Not anymore. My phone rang, cutting through the tension. I glanced at the screen. Detective Corbin. I'd told him where I'd be tonight, had told him I was confronting my family. I answered on speaker. Miss Vance. His voice filled the dining room, professional and authoritative. I wanted to inform you that we've completed our evidence review. We'll be executing the arrest warrant tomorrow morning as planned. Given the complexity of the fraud scheme and the additional evidence we've uncovered, we're also pursuing charges against Tiffany Vance for conspiracy to commit fraud and filing false documents. The words hung in the air like a pronouncement of doom. I watched my father's face cycle through shock, rage, and finally, a desperate kind of panic. Thank you, Detective. I said calmly, I'll be available if you need anything else. I ended the call and looked at my family. My father was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. Tiffany had gone completely still, her expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and terror. My mother was still crying, but softer now, hopeless rather than dramatic. You've destroyed us, my father said, his voice shaking with rage. Your own family, your own father. How can you live with yourself? I picked up my bag and walked toward the door. At the threshold, I turned back one last time. I'm not the one who destroyed this family, Dad. You did that all by yourself. I'm just the one who refused to go down with the ship. Then I walked out, leaving behind the house built on fraud, the family built on lies, and the version of myself who would have stayed silent to keep the peace. My father was arrested the next morning, exactly as Detective Corbin had promised. The news made the local papers. Local businessmen arrested for identity theft scheme. They didn't initially name me as the victim, but in a city like Seattle, word got around fast. By the end of the week, everyone knew that Victor Vance had stolen his own daughter's identity and that she'd been the one to turn him in. The reactions were mixed. Some people praised my courage. Others whispered that I was heartless, that family should forgive family, that I'd taken things too far. I stopped reading the comments on news articles. I stopped caring what strangers thought about decisions they'd never have to make themselves. The legal process ground forward with agonizing slowness. My father hired Marcus Thorne, an expensive defense attorney who specialized in white-collar crime. His strategy was predictable, claimed that I'd known about the mortgages, that I'd been complicit, that this was a family financial arrangement gone wrong rather than fraud. He tried to paint me as a bitter daughter seeking revenge over old grievances. It might have worked, except for the evidence. The forged signatures, the IP logs, the bankruptcy papers I'd never seen. The testimony from Sarah about my father's suspicious questions about mortgage fraud detection. The statements from contractors who'd been stiffed on payments while my father lived lavishly in his fraudulently obtained house. The trial took place 6 months after my father's arrest. I testified for 3 days, walking the jury through every detail of how I'd discovered the fraud, how I'd never received any money, how I'd never signed any documents. The defense attorney tried to rattle me, tried to make me seem vindictive or unreliable. But I'd been preparing for this. I was calm, factual, and unshakable. The hardest part was looking at my father across the courtroom. He'd aged in those 6 months. His expensive suits couldn't hide the way prison had hollowed him out. Sometimes I caught him staring at me with such hatred that I felt it like a physical force. Other times, he looked almost pleading, as if he still thought he could manipulate me into recanting. He couldn't. I told the truth, the whole truth, every ugly detail of it. Tiffany was tried separately. Her defense was that she'd been a dupe, that our father had manipulated her too, that she'd had no idea the invoices she'd provided were part of a fraud scheme. It was partly true. I did think my father had used her, had played on her greed and her desire for his approval, but she'd also chosen to look the other way, to not ask questions when things seemed suspicious, to prioritize profit over ethics. She got a lighter sentence than our father, 2 years probation and community service, but her design business never recovered. Clients didn't want to work with someone associated with fraud, no matter how tangentially. Last I heard, she'd closed the firm and moved to Portland, trying to start over where people didn't know her story. My father was convicted on all counts. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who'd clearly seen too many families destroyed by financial crimes, sentenced him to 5 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. He was also ordered to pay full restitution, although since he'd spent or lost most of the fraudulently obtained money, that was more symbolic than practical. When the sentence was read, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that it was over, that justice had been done, sadness for the family I'd thought I had, even if it had always been an illusion. And yes, a dark satisfaction that the man who'd tried to destroy me was now facing the consequences of his actions. The house on Beacon Hill was seized and sold at auction. The proceeds went to paying back some of the debts my father had incurred. It wasn't nearly enough to cover everything, but it was something. My mother divorced him while he was in prison. She moved in with her sister in Spokane and refused to speak to me for almost a year. When she finally called, her voice was small and broken. She apologized, not for defending my father initially, but for not seeing what he was capable of, for enabling his behavior for so long, for not protecting me when I needed her to. It wasn't enough, but it was something. We talk occasionally now, brief conversations about safe topics. I don't know if we'll ever be close, but at least we're honest with each other. The bank cleared the debts from my credit report, though it took months of paperwork and documentation. Slowly, painstakingly, I rebuilt my financial life. The ordeal had cost me in other ways, though. I'd had to take time off work for the trial, had racked up my own legal fees, had spent countless hours dealing with credit agencies and fraud departments and documentation requests. But I was free. My name was my own again. My credit was my own. My future was my own. About a year after my father's conviction, I started looking at houses. Not expensive houses, nothing like the fraud-funded monstrosity on Beacon Hill. Just a small, modest home that I could afford on my nurse's salary, something with a yard and good light and the potential to be truly mine. I found a bungalow in West Seattle, in a quiet neighborhood near Lincoln Park. It needed work, but it had good bones and a view of Puget Sound through the trees. Most importantly, every single document, every signature, every form was mine. No one else's name, no one else's debt, no one else's lies. The day I closed on the house, I sat on the front porch steps and cried, relief, joy, grief for what I'd lost and gratitude for what I'd gained. Sarah came over with champagne and we toasted to new beginnings. I planted an oak tree in the front yard that spring, not a dogwood like my mother always preferred, delicate and showy. An oak, strong and stubborn and built to last. I watered it carefully, watching it take root, watching it begin to grow. I started volunteering with a nonprofit that helped victims of identity theft and financial fraud. Once a week, I'd sit with people who were going through what I'd survived, helping them navigate the bureaucracy, encouraging them to stand up for themselves, showing them that it was possible to come out the other side whole. Some of them were victims of strangers, their information stolen by faceless criminals. Others were like me, betrayed by people they'd trusted, people who were supposed to love them. To those people especially, I'd say the same thing every time. You are not responsible for protecting people from the consequences of their own choices. You are only responsible for protecting yourself. It was a lesson I'd learned the hard way, but it was a lesson I'd carry with me for the rest of my life. 2 years after everything fell apart, I got a letter from the prison where my father was incarcerated. He wanted me to visit. I read the letter 3 times, trying to decide what to do. In the end, I went. Not because I owed him anything, but because I needed to see him one more time, needed to confirm that I'd made the right choice, needed to look him in the eye as the person I'd become, rather than the person he'd tried to destroy. The visiting room was exactly as depressing as I'd imagined. Pale walls, uncomfortable chairs, the smell of industrial cleaner and desperation. My father shuffled in wearing prison orange, looking older than his years, his face lined with bitterness. We sat across from each other in silence for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice rough from disuse. I didn't think you'd come. I almost didn't, I admitted. Are you here to gloat? To see what you've done to me? I looked at him steadily. I'm here to see the man who tried to frame me for his crimes, the man who cared more about saving his own skin than about his daughter's life. I'm here to remind myself why I did what I did. His face twisted. I'm your father. I gave you life. I raised you. Doesn't that count for anything? It counted for everything, I said quietly. That's why this hurt so much. That's why I tried so hard to find another explanation, any other explanation, before I accepted that you'd really done this. But being my father didn't give you the right to destroy me. It gave you the responsibility to protect me, and you failed, spectacularly. He leaned back in his chair, jaw clenched. I was trying to save the business. To preserve our legacy, to give you and your sister something to be proud of. By committing fraud? By stealing my identity? By preparing to frame me for bankruptcy? I shook my head. That's not a legacy, Dad. That's a crime spree. And you got caught. Because you turned me in, he spat, all pretense of civility dropping away. Your own father. You chose strangers over your own blood. I chose myself, I corrected. I chose my future, my integrity, my freedom. You gave me that choice when you decided to use me as your scapegoat. What did you expect me to do? Go to prison for you? Destroy my own life to save yours? I expected loyalty, he said bitterly. I expected you to understand that family comes first. Family should come first, I agreed. But you stopped treating me like family the moment you forged my signature on those documents. You made me into a tool, a means to an end. You can't have it both ways, Dad. You can't steal from someone and then demand their loyalty. We sat in silence for another minute. His hands were shaking slightly, whether from anger or something else, I couldn't tell. I don't forgive you, I finally said. I don't know if I ever will, but I'm not carrying this anger around anymore. It's too heavy, and it's not mine to carry. You made your choices. I made mine. We both have to live with the consequences. Easy for you to say, he muttered. You're not the one in prison. No, I agreed, because I didn't commit fraud. I didn't steal anyone's identity. I didn't try to destroy my own child to save myself. Your prison is your own creation, just like my freedom is mine. I stood up to leave. He looked up at me, and for just a moment, I saw something other than anger in his eyes. Regret, maybe. Or just the realization that he'd gambled everything and lost. Goodbye, Dad, I said. Don't come back, he replied, his voice hard again. If you're not here to help me, to support me, then I don't want to see you. Okay, I said simply. And I walked out. I never went back. Not when he was released 3 years later after serving most of his sentence. Not when I heard through my mother that he was living in a halfway house in Tacoma, trying to find work with a felony record. Not when he sent me a brief, grudging email that might have been an apology if you squinted at it hard enough. Some people thought I was cold, unforgiving, cruel. Those people had never had their identity stolen by someone who was supposed to love them. They'd never faced the choice between self-preservation and family loyalty. They'd never been forced to choose themselves first because no one else would. I had, and I'd made my choice. I wasn't going to apologize for it. Life moved forward in the way life does. I got a promotion at the hospital, eventually becoming a shift supervisor in the pediatric unit. I started dating again, cautiously at first, learning to trust people while also maintaining healthy boundaries. I met someone, a software engineer named Marcus, who'd been through his own family trauma and understood why I needed to move slowly, why I was careful about sharing my space in my life. We took things at my pace. He met Sarah first, passed her interrogation with flying colors. He learned about what my father had done not from gossip but from me, when I was ready to tell him. He never pushed, never pressured, never made me feel like I owed him anything just because he was patient with my healing. 3 years after I bought my house, Marcus moved in. 2 years after that, we got married in a small ceremony in my backyard, under the oak tree that was now strong and tall, its branches reaching toward the sky. My mother came, nervous and emotional, trying too hard to make up for lost time. Sarah was my maid of honor. A few colleagues from the hospital attended, people who'd supported me through the worst of the trial and its aftermath. Tiffany wasn't invited. I'd heard she was doing better, had started a small design consulting business in Portland, was in therapy working through her own issues with our father. I was genuinely glad for her, hoped she was finding her way to a healthier life. But I wasn't ready to have her in mine, might never be ready. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. Some relationships, once broken, aren't worth the effort of repair. And that was okay. I'd learned that family wasn't just about blood. It was about respect, trust, genuine care. The people at my wedding were my real family, the ones who'd chosen me and whom I'd chosen in return. My father wasn't at the wedding, obviously, but I thought about him briefly as Marcus and I exchanged vows. I wondered if he ever understood what he'd lost, if he ever truly comprehended that his choices had cost him not just his freedom, but his daughter. I wondered if he blamed himself, or if he still blamed me. Then I let the thought go and focused on the man standing in front of me, the man who saw me not as a tool or a scapegoat, but as a partner, an equal, someone worthy of love and respect. The work with the identity theft nonprofit continued. Over the years, I helped dozens of people navigate the nightmare I'd survived. Some of them were victims of family members like I'd been. Parents who'd stolen their children's identities, siblings who'd taken out credit cards in each other's names, spouses who'd hidden financial abuse behind closed doors. To every single one of them, I told my story. Not to scare them, but to show them that survival was possible, that justice was achievable, that they could reclaim their lives even when it seemed impossible. I told them about the phone call that had shattered my world, about the moment I'd seen the forged signatures and known my father had betrayed me. I told them about the fear and the guilt and the pressure to stay silent, to protect the person who'd hurt me. And I told them about the moment I'd chosen myself, chosen truth, chosen freedom, even though it cost me everything I thought I knew about family. It's not easy, I'd always say. It's probably the hardest thing you'll ever do. People will judge you. They'll say you're vindictive or unforgiving or cruel. They'll tell you family should forgive family, that you should let it go, that pressing charges is too extreme. But here's what I learned. The people saying those things aren't the ones dealing with the consequences of the fraud. They're not the ones facing financial ruin or criminal charges or destroyed credit. You are, and you're the only one who can protect yourself. Some of them found the courage to report their abusers. Others couldn't, weren't ready, and I never judged them for that. Healing isn't linear, and everyone's path is different. What mattered was that they knew they had options, that they weren't alone, that someone else had walked this road before them and made it to the other side. 5 years after my father went to prison, I finally felt like I'd fully reclaimed my life. The hypervigilance had faded. I could look at my credit report without my heart racing. I could sign documents without checking and rechecking every detail, without the paranoid fear that someone was forging my signature somewhere. The oak tree in my front yard was thriving, its roots deep and strong. Marcus and I had painted the house a warm yellow that caught the afternoon light. I'd planted flower beds full of hardy perennials that came back year after year without needing constant attention. Everything about the house, about my life, spoke of stability and permanence, and things that were built to last. I kept my important documents in a fireproof safe now, something I'd never done before the fraud. I monitored my credit religiously, checked my bank accounts daily, maintained a level of financial vigilance that probably seemed excessive to people who'd never been victimized. But it made me feel secure, and security was worth any amount of effort. Sometimes I'd sit on my front porch in the evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, and I'd think about the alternate version of my life. The one where I'd stayed silent about the fraud, where I'd let my father use me as his scapegoat, where I'd sacrifice myself to preserve family harmony. In that version, I'd be in debt. My credit would be destroyed. I might even have criminal charges hanging over my head if my father had successfully filed that bankruptcy in my name. I'd be living in fear, always waiting for the other shoe to drop, never able to build anything stable because the foundation of my life would be built on lies. Instead, I had this: a house I owned free and clear, a marriage built on honesty and mutual respect, a career I was good at, a sense of peace that came from knowing I'd stood up for myself when it mattered most. The cost had been high. I'd lost most of my biological family. I carried trauma that would probably never fully heal. I had trust issues that required constant maintenance. But I'd also gained something invaluable: myself, my authentic, uncompromised, fully realized self. My mother and I had slowly, painfully rebuilt some semblance of a relationship. She'd never fully acknowledged her role in enabling my father, never really apologized for choosing his version of events over mine for so long. But she'd divorced him, had gone to therapy, had tried in her limited way to understand why I'd done what I'd done. We had lunch once a month now, usually at a neutral restaurant where we could make small talk about her garden and my work without diving into deeper, more painful topics. It wasn't the relationship either of us had probably hoped for, but it was honest, which was more than we'd ever had before. She never asked me to forgive my father. I think she finally understood that forgiveness wasn't something I owed anyone, least of all the man who'd tried to destroy me. One afternoon, about 6 years after the trial, I was working in my garden when a car pulled up in front of my house. A woman got out, mid-30s, professionally dressed, looking nervous. She approached my fence hesitantly. "Are you Zelda Vance?" she asked. I stood up, brushing dirt off my knees. "I am. Can I help you?" "My name is Rachel Hoffman. I'm a journalist working on a story about familial identity theft. I was hoping I could interview you about your experience." I'd done a few small interviews over the years, mostly for nonprofit newsletters and local news segments. But this felt different, bigger. "What kind of story?" I asked cautiously. "A long-form piece for a national magazine," she explained. Identity theft by family members is more common than most people realize, but victims rarely report it because of the family pressure to stay silent. Your case is one of the few that went to trial and resulted in a conviction. I think your story could help other people understand what's at stake, could give other victims the courage to come forward. I thought about it for a moment, weighing my desire for privacy against the potential to help others. Finally, I nodded. "Okay, come on in." We talked for 3 hours. I told her everything: the phone call from the bank, the discovery of the forged documents, the moment I'd realized my father was preparing to frame me for bankruptcy. I told her about the family pressure, the threats, the guilt they'd tried to impose. I told her about the trial, about testifying against my own father, about the mix of relief and grief when he was convicted. She took notes furiously, asked thoughtful questions, seemed genuinely moved by the story. When we finished, she looked at me with something like admiration. "How do you feel about it now?" she asked. Looking back, knowing what it cost you? Would you make the same choice? I didn't have to think about my answer. Absolutely, without question. What my father did was wrong, and someone had to hold him accountable. If I hadn't, he would have destroyed me and moved on to his next victim without a second thought. Standing up for myself wasn't just the right thing to do, it was the only thing I could do and still live with myself. The article came out 6 months later. It was powerful, well-researched, and it told my story alongside those of several other victims of familial identity theft. The response was overwhelming. I got emails from people all over the country sharing their own experiences, thanking me for speaking out, asking for advice on how to protect themselves or how to report family members who'd victimized them. Some of the messages broke my heart. Adult children whose parents had been stealing their identities since they were teenagers, racking up thousands in debt before they even knew what credit was. Siblings who discovered their brothers or sisters had been using their information for years. Spouses who'd found out their partners had taken out loans and credit cards in their names. All of them shared the same fear, that reporting the fraud would make them the villain, that they'd be seen as betraying family, that they'd be blamed for destroying relationships that were already broken. To each of them, I responded with the same message. You are not responsible for protecting people from the consequences of their own choices. Document everything. Report it. Protect yourself. You deserve a life that's truly yours. The nonprofit where I volunteered saw a surge in calls after the article published. We had to bring on more volunteers to handle the increased demand. I helped train them, teaching them not just about the practical steps of reporting fraud, but about the emotional toll, the guilt, the pressure victims faced from family members who prioritized reputation over justice. Life continued to get better in small, significant ways. Marcus and I talked about starting a family, about whether we wanted to have children or adopt or remain just the two of us. We hadn't decided yet. We're taking our time, and that was okay. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had the luxury of time, the security to make decisions without desperation or pressure. I got a letter one day from someone unexpected, a prison counselor who'd worked with my father during his incarceration. She said he'd been in her therapy group, had slowly, grudgingly begun to acknowledge what he'd done. She wasn't writing to ask me to forgive him or to reconcile. She just thought I'd want to know that he'd stopped blaming me, at least in his therapy sessions, and had started taking some responsibility for his actions. I appreciated the letter, but it didn't change anything for me. I was glad my father was working on himself, hoped he'd become a better person, but I had no interest in being part of that journey. My healing had happened separately from his, and that's how it needed to stay. Tiffany reached out once, about 7 years after the trial. An email, carefully worded, saying she understood why I'd cut contact, that she didn't blame me, that she hoped someday we might be able to reconnect. She'd been in therapy too, had come to recognize her own complicity in our father's schemes, had acknowledged the ways she'd benefited from his fraud while I'd been set up to take the fall. I read the email several times, felt the old tangle of emotions, anger at what she'd done, sadness for the sister relationship we'd never really had, relief that she seemed to be taking accountability. I didn't respond right away. I sat with it for weeks, talked it through with Marcus and Sarah, tried to figure out what I wanted. In the end, I sent a brief reply thanking her for reaching out but explaining that I wasn't ready for a relationship. Maybe someday, maybe never. I needed to leave that door open to possibility without committing to walking through it. She didn't push, didn't guilt-trip me. Just sent back a simple message saying she understood and respected my boundaries. It was more than I'd expected, and it eased something in me that I hadn't realized was still tight. 8 years after the phone call that changed everything, I stood in my backyard under the oak tree I'd planted, surrounded by the garden I'd tended, in the house I'd bought with my own money and my own name, and I felt something I'd never quite experienced before. Complete and utter peace. Not happiness necessarily, though I was happy. Not satisfaction, though I was satisfied with my life. But peace. The deep, bone-level certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, that I'd made the right choices even when they were hard, that I'd protected the most important thing, my own integrity, my own identity, my own future. The scars from what my father did would always be there. I'd always be a little more vigilant, a little more protective of my personal information, a little slower to trust. But those scars were proof that I'd survived, that I'd fought back, that I'd refused to be a victim. I thought about the woman I'd been 8 years ago, the one who'd answered that phone call from the bank with no idea her entire life was about to implode. I wished I could go back and tell her that she'd be okay, that she'd be more than okay, that she'd build a life more authentic and meaningful than anything she'd had before. But she couldn't have known that then. She'd had to walk through the fire to get here, had to make impossible choices and live with their consequences. And in the end, that's what made the peace so real, so earned. Marcus came out onto the porch, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. He handed me one and settled into the chair next to mine, not saying anything, just being present. That was one of the things I loved most about him. He understood that sometimes presence was enough, that not everything needed words. We sat together as the evening light faded, watching the oak tree's shadow stretch across the lawn. The tree that symbolized everything I'd rebuilt. Strong, rooted, reaching always toward the light. I'd planted it as a sapling, barely more than a stick in the ground. Now it was taller than the house, its branches providing shade, its roots holding firm against wind and rain. It had grown at the same pace as my healing, slowly but steadily, one season at a time. "What are you thinking about?" Marcus asked eventually. "That I made the right choice," I said. "Every single time, I made the right choice. Even when it was hard, even when it cost me. I chose myself, and look what I built." He reached over and took my hand. "You did build something amazing. I'm proud of you." "I'm proud of me too," I said, and I meant it. Not in an arrogant way, but in the way of someone who'd been tested and come through stronger. I'd faced one of the worst betrayals imaginable, and I hadn't just survived it. I'd used it as a foundation to build something better than what I'd had before. The phone calls from family members trying to guilt me into dropping the charges had stopped years ago. The whispers and judgment from people who thought I'd gone too far had faded into irrelevance. The trauma that once dominated my life had been integrated, processed, transformed into wisdom and strength. I was Zelda Vance, and my name was my own. My credit was my own. My house was my own. My life was my own. No one could take that from me ever again, because I'd learned the most important lesson of all. I was worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth choosing even when everyone else wanted me to sacrifice myself for their comfort. The oak tree rustled in the breeze, its leaves whispering secrets only growing things know. About resilience. About putting down roots even in damaged soil. About reaching toward light even when surrounded by darkness. I'd been that sapling once, barely surviving, struggling to take root in the aftermath of betrayal. Now I was strong enough to provide shade for others, to offer shelter, to stand firm no matter what storms came. And I would stand firm. For myself, for the people I helped through the nonprofit, for every victim who needed to know that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. The sun set completely, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Marcus squeezed my hand gently. Inside the house, our life waited. Dinner to cook, shows to watch, comfortable routines built on honesty and trust. I took one last look at the oak tree, its silhouette strong against the twilight, and I smiled. This was my legacy. Not a house bought with fraud, not a family held together by lies and manipulation, not a life lived for someone else's approval. This was real. This was mine. This was worth everything it had cost me to get here, and I would never, ever regret fighting for it.